Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In January 1919, American soldiers stood guard in northern Russia. They were thousands of miles from home, surrounded by frozen forests, fighting in temperatures that dropped below minus 40 degrees. Some of them would never return. Many of them did not even understand why they were there. The enemy they were shooting at spoke Russian. So did the people they were supposed to be helping. This was not the Cold War. This was before it. Years later, the United States and the Soviet Union would face each other across nuclear missiles, divided by ideology and fear. It would look inevitable, as if hatred had always been there, waiting to surface. But history rarely moves in straight lines. Before suspicion hardened into doctrine, before rivalry became permanent, there were moments of confusion, hesitation, and choices made without knowing where they would lead. The Cold War did not begin with certainty. It began with misunderstanding. To answer whether the United States and the Soviet Union always hated each other, you have to start here, before the slogans, before the alliances, and before anyone knew what kind of enemy the other would become. At the start of the 20th century, the United States and Russia were not enemies. They were not even rivals. They existed far apart, focused on different problems, with little reason to collide. Unlike the great powers of Europe, they shared no long history of war, no contested borders, and no inherited grievances. For American leaders, Russia was distant and largely irrelevant. The Russian Empire's power was concentrated in Europe and Asia, far from American trade routes and military planning. Washington worried about Britain, Germany, and later Japan, but rarely about Russia. When Russia appeared in American newspapers, it was usually as a troubled empire, not a looming threat. From Russia's perspective, the United States barely registered. American power was growing, but it was directed inward and westward. Russia's concerns lay closer to home, maintaining control over a vast, unstable empire and competing with European rivals along its borders. The two countries watched different parts of the world. This distance created something unusual in great power politics: indifference. There was no need for alliance, but also no pressure for confrontation. Their relationship was defined less by hostility than by absence. They simply did not matter much to each other. That indifference began to erode during the First World War. The collapse of Europe's old balance of power pulled both countries into unfamiliar positions. The United States moved closer to global leadership. Russia, battered by war, moved toward internal collapse. For the first time, their futures were no longer completely separate. When revolution swept through Russia in 1917, the problem for Washington was not fear of communism. It was uncertainty. The government America had known for decades was gone, replaced by a movement that rejected the political rules everyone else was using. The question was not yet whether Russia had become an enemy, but whether it was still a country the United States could deal with at all. How American leaders answered that question would shape everything that followed. Woodrow Wilson did not look at the Russian Revolution and see an enemy. He saw a problem that threatened the order he was trying to build. Wilson believed history could be guided by moral design, that nations, if organized correctly, would choose stability over chaos. Russia's collapse during the First World War endangered that vision. From Wilson's perspective, Russia still mattered. It had been an ally against Germany, and its disintegration risked leaving a vacuum across Eastern Europe. If Russia fell apart completely, stronger powers would fill the space, and the peace Wilson hoped to shape would unravel before it even began. The revolution, however radical, did not yet disqualify Russia from that future. Lenin saw the world differently. Where Wilson saw moral order, Lenin saw decay. He believed the war had exposed capitalism as a system built on exploitation and lies. Western treaties, parliaments, and diplomatic rituals meant nothing to him. They were props in a collapsing performance. Russia's revolution was not a disruption to be managed. It was the opening act of a global transformation. This clash of worldviews was personal, as much as political. Wilson spoke of self-determination and lawful peace. Lenin spoke of class war and historical inevitability. Each man believed he understood the direction of history. Each believed the other was clinging to a dying illusion. At first, these beliefs did not translate into open hostility. The United States did not rush to isolate the new Bolshevik government. Wilson still hoped that Russia's internal chaos might resolve itself, or at least be softened through engagement. The revolution was treated as unstable, not permanent. The Bolsheviks, however, assumed confrontation was inevitable. They expected the capitalist powers to turn against them once the war ended. Even gestures of engagement were viewed as temporary or deceptive. Trust never had a chance to form because neither side believed the other was acting in good faith. This mutual suspicion did not explode immediately. Instead, it lingered beneath the surface, waiting for a moment when ideas would collide with reality. That moment came in 1919, when Wilson tried to bring Russia's civil war into the diplomatic heart of the post-war world, and discovered that there was no common language left to speak. In 1919, Woodrow Wilson attempted to turn uncertainty into control. At the Paris Peace Conference, he authorized an unusual move, inviting representatives from both sides of the Russian Civil War. It was an act rooted in belief rather than leverage. Wilson assumed that if Russia's future could be discussed alongside Europe's, it could be guided back into an orderly international system. The reality on the ground made that impossible. The white forces fighting the Bolsheviks were fractured and weak. They held territory inconsistently, depended heavily on foreign aid, and could not credibly promise anything on Russia's behalf. In Paris, they spoke as if they represented a future government, but everyone in the room understood they did not control the present. The Bolsheviks refused to participate at all. To Lenin, the conference was theater, victors dividing spoils while pretending to design peace. He dismissed the treaties being drafted as imperial paperwork that would soon be torn apart by revolution. There was no reason to negotiate terms with a system he believed would not survive the decade. What unfolded was not a failed negotiation, but a revelation. The United States approached Russia's crisis as a political problem that could be mediated. The Bolsheviks approached it as a revolutionary struggle that could not be compromised without betraying its purpose. They were not disagreeing over details. They were operating under incompatible assumptions about what politics itself meant. This moment mattered because it closed a door. Until Paris, engagement had still seemed possible. After it, dialogue felt performative at best and dangerous at worst. The United States began to accept that there was no partner on the Russian side who could deliver stability. The Bolsheviks concluded that Western diplomacy was simply another tool of interference. As the Civil War continued, Washington faced a new fear. If it stayed out entirely, other powers might decide Russia's future instead. If it stepped in too forcefully, it risked confirming Bolshevik paranoia. The decision that followed was meant to be cautious and temporary, but it would leave behind consequences neither side could control. The caution Washington believed it was exercising vanished the moment American boots hit Russian soil. In 1918, U.S. troops were sent to northern Russia as part of what would later be known as the Polar Bear Expedition. Officially, their mission was limited: protect Allied supplies, assist the evacuation of the Czech Legion, and prevent Japanese forces from dominating the region. Unofficially, many of the soldiers had no clear idea why they were there at all. They landed near Archangel and Murmansk, ports choked by ice and darkness. Winter temperatures dropped to 40 and 50 degrees below zero. Rifles froze. Engines failed. Men wrapped newspapers around their boots to stop their feet from turning black. This was not a battlefield they recognized, and it was not a war they understood. Then the shooting started. American soldiers found themselves exchanging fire with Bolshevik forces, men who, only months earlier, had been part of an allied nation. Patrols vanished into the forest. Small units were ambushed along frozen rivers. Some American troops froze to death before ever seeing an enemy. Others died wondering why they were fighting Russians in a civil war no one had explained to them. To Washington, this was still a defensive deployment. Officials insisted the mission was temporary and restrained, but restraint does not survive contact with bullets. On the ground, American soldiers were killing Bolsheviks, and Bolsheviks were killing Americans. Whatever the intention, the message was unmistakable. For the Bolshevik leadership, this was confirmation of everything they feared. Foreign troops had arrived not as observers, but as combatants. The revolution, they concluded, was under attack. It did not matter how limited the deployment was meant to be. The presence of American dead on Russian soil erased any distinction between intervention and war. The expedition ended quietly. By 1919, American forces withdrew, having gained nothing strategically and lost hundreds of men to combat, disease, and cold. In the United States, the episode faded from memory. In Moscow, it did not. This was the first time Americans and Bolsheviks had shot at each other. It would not be the last time mistrust hardened into something permanent. When the Civil War ended and the Soviet state emerged victorious, it carried with it the memory of frozen battlefields and foreign rifles. From that point on, neutrality no longer felt possible. The question facing Washington was no longer whether misunderstanding had occurred. It was whether the damage could still be undone. When the fighting in Russia finally ended and the Bolsheviks consolidated power, the United States faced a reckoning it could not avoid. The question of recognition returned, but this time it was inseparable from money. During the revolution, the new Soviet government had seized foreign-owned factories, railways, and banks. It had also done something unprecedented. It refused to repay the debts of the old Russian state. For American investors, this was not an abstract policy dispute. It was personal. Bonds that had once been considered safe were suddenly worthless. Entire companies saw their assets vanish overnight. And when Western creditors demanded answers, the response from Moscow was blunt. The debts were imperial. The assets were gone. There would be no repayment. In Washington, this felt less like a policy disagreement and more like an insult. Recognition would not merely acknowledge a new government, it would legitimize what many saw as the largest financial theft in modern history. To recognize the Soviet Union meant telling American investors that their losses were final and that the United States would accept it. No administration was prepared to do that. The Soviet leadership did not attempt to soften the blow. From their perspective, nationalization was not a negotiating tactic. It was the point of the revolution. Lenin openly mocked the idea that capitalist governments could pressure a worker state into honoring imperial debts. The outrage of foreign creditors was proof that the old system was collapsing exactly as predicted. What followed was not confrontation, but estrangement. The United States refused recognition. The Soviet Union stopped asking for it. There were no embassies, no formal talks, and no serious effort to rebuild trust. Each side walked away, convinced the other had revealed its true character. This moment mattered because it transformed suspicion into memory. The polar bear expedition had planted fear. The debt repudiation added resentment. Together, they created a narrative on both sides. The United States saw a government that stole and laughed about it. The Soviets saw a capitalist power that demanded submission and punishment. By the early 1920s, hostility did not yet dominate policy, but indifference was no longer neutral. Silence hardened grievances instead of resolving them. And as both countries turned inward, the space where trust might have been rebuilt quietly disappeared. Through the 1920s, the United States and the Soviet Union did not confront each other head-on. Instead, they settled into a tense absence. There were no embassies, no regular negotiations, and no serious attempts at reconciliation. Each side chose distance, believing that disengagement was safer than engagement with a system they did not trust. In the United States, the anger sparked by lost investment slowly cooled. Wall Street moved on. New markets mattered more than old grievances. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was still an economic unknown, dangerous, unstable, and isolated. Most American policymakers concluded that there was little to gain by reopening a relationship defined by betrayal and bloodshed in the frozen North. In Moscow, the interpretation was harsher. Soviet leaders did not see American indifference as neutrality. They saw it as proof that the capitalist world would never accept a revolutionary state unless it submitted. The lack of recognition was taken as confirmation that hostility was permanent, even if it was temporarily quiet. Yet ideology did not drive action during this period. The Soviet Union was focused inward, rebuilding a shattered economy and enforcing political control. Exporting revolution took a back seat to survival. The United States, enjoying economic growth and relative security, saw no reason to provoke a confrontation with a distant and impoverished state. This produced a dangerous illusion. Without open conflict, it was easy to believe the relationship had stabilized. But in reality, mistrust was deepening without challenge. Each side filled the silence with its own assumptions, interpreting the other through fear rather than experience. What broke this standoff was not ideology or memory, but crisis. When the global economy collapsed at the end of the decade, indifference became a luxury neither side could afford. Economic survival forced Washington to reconsider relationships it had once written off, including the one it had left frozen since the Revolution. In 1933, the silence finally broke. The United States formally recognized the Soviet Union, ending more than a decade of deliberate distance. The decision was not driven by forgiveness or ideological change. It was driven by desperation. The Great Depression had shattered global trade, and American leaders were searching for any way to reopen markets and stabilize a collapsing economy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt treated recognition as a transaction, not a reconciliation. He did not trust the Soviet system, and he did not expect goodwill in return. What he wanted was leverage. In exchange for diplomatic recognition, the Soviet government promised expanded trade, protection for American citizens, and assurances, made quietly, without ceremony, that it would not interfere in U.S. domestic politics. In Moscow, recognition was celebrated for a different reason. It was validation. For years, the Soviet Union had existed as an international outcast, dismissed as illegitimate. Recognition by the United States signaled that the revolution had survived. The promises made to Washington were convenient and, in many cases, disposable. What mattered was legitimacy. The reopening of embassies changed the texture of the relationship. Diplomats replaced silence. Messages replaced assumptions. Suspicion remained, but it now had to compete with information. For the first time since the Civil War, the two governments were forced to deal with each other as permanent realities rather than temporary problems. This did not create trust. American officials remained wary, watching Soviet behavior closely. Soviet leaders assumed American engagement was temporary and self-interested. Cooperation was thin and cautious, but it existed. The relationship had moved from absence to management. That fragile arrangement might have endured longer if the world had remained stable. It did not. As Europe drifted toward another war, the question shifted again. Not whether the United States and the Soviet Union could tolerate each other, but whether they could survive without cooperation. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, every assumption that had defined U.S.-Soviet relations collapsed overnight. Until then, cooperation had been cautious and optional. Now it became unavoidable. A German victory in the East would leave Europe dominated by a single hostile power, something American leaders had been trying to prevent since the war began. The United States moved quickly, even before it formally entered the war. Through Lend-Lease, American ships carried trucks, food, fuel, aircraft, and industrial equipment across dangerous sea routes to Soviet ports. These supplies did not win battles on their own, but they made sustained resistance possible. Soviet soldiers could fight, but without American logistics they would struggle to keep moving. This alliance was never built on trust. In Washington, officials were deeply uneasy about what a strengthened Soviet Union might mean after the war. Aid was given not because the United States believed in the Soviet system, but because the alternative, a Soviet collapse, would be catastrophic. The enemy of necessity was Germany, not communism. Soviet leaders understood this clearly. They accepted American support while assuming that cooperation would not survive the defeat of Hitler. The war demanded coordination, but it did not erase memory. The Polar Bear expedition, the years of isolation, and the humiliation of delayed recognition were not forgotten in Moscow. Even at the height of cooperation, tension never disappeared. Disputes over opening a second front in Europe, disagreements about post-war borders, and mutual suspicion shaped every meeting. The alliance functioned, but it did not heal. By the time Allied forces closed in on Berlin, the United States and the Soviet Union had proven they could fight together without resolving what separated them. The war had forced alignment, not reconciliation. Once the common enemy vanished, the unresolved fear beneath that cooperation would determine what came next. Victory in Europe did not bring relief. It brought clarity and fear. As the war ended, American officials expected the Soviet Union to pull back. The assumption was simple: a country that had lost tens of millions of people and seen entire regions destroyed would be too exhausted to dominate anyone else. Cooperation during the war had been brutal and costly. Many in Washington believed that shared sacrifice would naturally lead to restraint. Instead, the Red Army stayed where it was. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet troops did not withdraw. They dismantled old governments, supported new ones, and reshaped political systems under their protection. What had been explained during the war as temporary military necessity now looked permanent. From Poland to Hungary to East Germany, influence was not negotiated, it was imposed. In Washington, this felt like betrayal. The United States had supplied the Soviet war effort with trucks, fuel, and food, believing that cooperation would lead to a stable peace. Instead, it appeared to have helped create a new concentration of power in Europe. The fear was no longer ideological, it was strategic. A single force now controlled half the continent. Moscow saw something entirely different. Soviet leaders believed they were acting defensively. Twice in a generation, invasions had come from the West. Eastern Europe was not a prize, it was a shield. To withdraw would be to invite the next catastrophe. What Americans called expansion, Soviets called survival. These interpretations could not be reconciled. Every move was filtered through worst-case assumptions. American aid was reinterpreted as manipulation. Soviet security measures were read as aggression. The habits of cooperation built during the war collapsed almost immediately, replaced by planning based on deterrence and fear. By the late 1940s, the relationship had hardened into structure. Alliances formed, doctrines were written, borders were sealed. An invisible line cut across Europe, separating two systems that no longer believed misunderstanding was the problem. The United States and the Soviet Union had not always hated each other, but by this point, hatred no longer needed history to sustain it. Fear had become enough. And once fear took over, the door that had once allowed uncertainty, distance, and hesitation closed for good.